Yes, hello everyone. So my name is Roy and I will be talking about enriching data and headless GraphQL architectures today. So what is this talk about? As I already told, it's about GraphQL and it's about headless architectures. But most of all, it's how you can bring those things together. So you might see yourself in a situation where you have a CMS, maybe it's headless, maybe it isn't, but you also want an e-commerce store. So back in old days, you probably had installed some open source variant that had some plugins that could help you building that e-commerce store. But I think where we're at nowadays, you don't really want to have plugins that plug directly into one sort of monolith situation. So if you already have a CMS, but you're also looking to get an e-commerce store, there might be something else that you need to do. And also you might be in the other way around. So maybe you already have an e-commerce store. Maybe it's one of those famous open source projects that maybe is using the LAMP stack still, and you want to enrich your data. So also in that situation, you probably end up installing some sort of plugin that will make it possible for you to have that CMS inside your e-commerce store or to actually enrich your data up there. But also, if I look at today, you could maybe already have both. So instead of having the plugin parts with either an open source CMS or either an open source e-commerce store and enrich them with plugins, you can also have both an open source CMS and an open source e-commerce store and bring those things together. And those can be open source, but of course, these can also be enterprise architectures. And if we're looking at what I'm going to be talking about today, those will be headless architectures as well. So a little bit about myself. I already told you my name is Roy. Currently, I'm mostly working on open source projects and also helping companies to scale their GraphQL or TypeScript or React architectures. I already written quite some books. The latest one was actually full stack GraphQL, which might be interesting for you, especially looking as we're at GraphQL Conf Day. And next to that, I enjoy speaking, giving workshops a lot. So make sure to find me on YouTube as well, in case you want to learn more about me. And of course, connect with me on Twitter so we can have more ongoing conversations after this talk if you want to. And so today's subject is about bringing headless architectures together. And headless architectures are getting more and more popular. So maybe you're already using some headless architectures today. So maybe you have an open source CMS that is headless. Maybe you have an enterprise CMS that is headless. Or maybe you're already integrating with other services that are providing APIs, which means they could also be headless, because headless is quite of a broad term. If you're using Facebook for social logins and providing an API and actually providing APIs for almost everything, it's almost like a headless architecture, but of course it's not your own product. So if you have a headless architecture, it's generally your own product that you have built something on top of that's headless, or either someone else's product that you're paying for, either installed open source, in order to use the full product in a headless way. And this is mostly due to the gem stack. So you might recall the LAMP stack, which I briefly encountered on before. So WordPress is, I think, one of the most important, or not really important, but one of the most popular things that is running on the LAMP stack. I think if you look at today, it's usually the gem stack. And the gem stack, people have more control over what they're using. So my ideal gem stack would be something like this. So you would have JavaScript or TypeScript with React. Then you would have APIs, and those APIs are probably with GraphQL, and then you have a markup part which is done with Next.js. So with Next.js is generally my go-to tool to build applications with GraphQL, TypeScript, and React. But you could of course also use something else like Gatsby, or maybe if you're not into React, you can think about Vue, Angular, or Svelte. So there are lots of ways to bring together the gem stack, and it's also one of the cool things. And for today, we'll be looking at the APIs part of this. So the APIs part of this looks a bit like this. So it's GraphQL. It doesn't have to be GraphQL, of course. It can also be a REST API or some other kind of API that you're using right inside your gem stack. But for today, we're going to be looking at using GraphQL APIs for this. And typically, when I work with headless architectures, I also want to use GraphQL for those architectures. So I typically love the GraphQL in headless architectures for most of my parts, partly because they can be easily combined. And this is not only due to the fact that they're headless, but it's also due to the fact that they're using GraphQL, because GraphQL architectures are easy to combine with. And so for this talk, what I want to focus on is, suppose you want to combine a headless CMS. So this can be anything. I believe the sponsor of this conference is also GraphCMS, they're offering a headless CMS. So in theory, you could combine them with any e-commerce API. So one of the sponsors for the other sponsor for the conference is also building headless e-commerce APIs. So suppose you want to bring together these two headless architectures. So we have a headless CMS and we have a headless e-commerce API that we want to combine together. But how can we do this? So there are multiple ways to bring them together. One of my favorite ones is actually Schema Stitching. And I think some people also thought Schema Stitching was dead because Schema Stitching used to be a product from Apollo, and they chose to go with Apollo Federations for all sorts of reasons, basically meaning they abandoned the Schema Stitching project. But now a nice niche agency that's working on a lot of GraphQL open source projects called The Guild are actually integrated Schema Stitching into GraphQL Tools. And GraphQL Tools is already one of the most popular open source library to create GraphQL servers, but also to work with your GraphQL on the front end. So Schema Stitching is now part of GraphQL Tools. So let's have a look at how you can actually use something like Schema Stitching in order to create a combined GraphQL server or server GraphQL schema together with our headless e-commerce API and also our headless CMS. So if you look on the left, we can see two possible queries from the schemas of both the architectures. So the headless architecture for our e-commerce store has a query to get products with a title and a price, while our headless architecture for the CMS has a query to get posts. And so CMS, you write post, in an e-commerce store you sell products. So both queries are pretty straightforward. So both queries are properly also present on most of the headless architecture you can imagine for a CMS or a store. And we want to combine them into one schema. So we maybe want to have so in this situation, the products is leading. So we want to have our products and we want to add posts to our products, which kind of makes sense because, typically the description fields for e-commerce APIs are a bit limited. And you actually want to add some CMS information in there because maybe it's can also different parties, a different part of your company that are working on these things. So you want to have them to have separate tools that you want to bring together in one schema. And we can all do this on the front end using GraphQL, using React, and bring it together with Next.js. So typically Jamstack bring together JavaScript to TypeScript with React, add some GraphQL for APIs, and then have Next.js in order to render the markup. And how does this work? So if you're going to look at the two schemas and queries again, so we would have a query for the CMS, in which we have a description field that we actually want to add to our products query. So whenever we query a product from our front end, we want to get the product information from our headless e-commerce store, but we also want to add rich metadata or rich extended data from our CMS. So we're going to have the get post query stitched into our get products query by using Schema Stitching. And we're all going to do this from our front end using GraphQL, React, JavaScript, and Next.js, so the typical Jamstack. So what are the advantages to this? Because of course, from your front-end project, you could call both GraphQL servers, just get data from them, and then bring them together on your front end, which is, something very straightforward to do. And I think for most use cases, it can be a good solution. Just have multiple queries to multiple GraphQL services from your front-end app, and then bring the data together there, because that's the most straightforward one. But something else I like, and this is especially interesting if you want to stitch together more than one field, is that you will have one unified schema in this setup. If you're using TypeScript, you can therefore merge types. So if you have one unified schema, you can actually automatically generate TypeScript types from that one schema, instead of from two different schemas, and then you just figure out how you bring those things together, which would mean you still have to bring together some TypeScript types, or maybe even merge them yourself, which is something you want to avoid, because you also get away the advantage you have with using GraphQL, and you can automatically generate code and types from it. So that's a disadvantage actually if you would do it separately. And also data normalization, because you would have one query already that is merged together or stitched actually, so you don't have to normalize the data yourself on the front end, which will save you quite some time. And as I already told you, we can do all of this from the client. So we have one GraphQL client inside our Next.js application that's using GraphQL Tools and also Next. And for Next, we're going to use API routes. And if you're not familiar with Next API routes already, so they're a great way to replace your backend for front-end code. We're actually doing all of this from just one front-end project. So you no longer need to separate, so you no longer need to call APIs, in example, in a separate project if you want to have a backend for front end. So you can actually do it all from Next.js at once. So I think in the future this will bring large improvements to Next.js as a framework, but also as a one unified way to build entire projects from one project. And for GraphQL Tools, I already mentioned we're going to be using several things from there, but the most important one is Schema Stitching. So let's look at some code. You can also find this code on my GitHub. It's called Headless Schema Stitching. And I'll also share a QR code at the end of this talk, which you can easily scan with your phone. So you can find it more easy. And if you're a fast typer, then maybe you can already find it. Nevertheless, if you go to github.com/Derks, you can already find it probably somewhere on the list. So let us find some code. So yeah, the thing I've done, I've created an example project with Next.js. So let me make this a tad bit bigger so everyone can find it. So before looking at the code, let's look at some things I've done. So I actually created two GraphQL servers that we use today. So one is the one GraphQL server in which we can get post informations. So let's say this is our headless CMS. Okay, very well. So in our headless CMS, you can see we can get post information, title, more information here, like views also. It's not really relevant. I think the most important part is title. And then maybe in future, you want to enrich it with maybe like a description. Maybe you would have some related posts. So these are all things you maybe can add in the future. But for now, we're going to have one headless CMS in here. It's running on port 3001, and it's a local server for now. It could be any headless architecture for CMS that you want, like the one we call the Graph CMS, maybe Strapi, some of the other examples you can find out there. So this is a headless CMS. And then on another port 3002, I have my headless e-commerce API running. So you can get products in there with a title, a great t-shirt, a dog. There's more information in here. An example, maybe like categories. Actually, I'm not sure what kind of information is in here. You can probably find it. We just have an ID in the title for now, which is fine. Maybe in future you want to enhance it with like a price. Maybe you would have categories, which could be relational. You see what I get there. So we want to stitch together those two APIs. So the one will get us post from a CMS, while the other will get us products from an e-commerce API. So this all looks pretty straightforward. And then for the stitching together, like I mentioned, we're going to use GraphQL Tools. So in here, I'm using API routes. So the API routes, so that code in here as well. Just get rid of it for simplicity. So I've created an API route in Next.js. And we should look like this. So you would have pages like you already have in Next.js. You would have like your home page, which is the index one. And then you would have an underscore app in which you do certain boilerplate part. And then whenever you create something called API, you can just name it anything. So we will now create something like dash API dash GraphQL. And whatever we return on here, so what we return on here is the Apollo server. And I will show you how I created the Apollo server later. But instead of returning React components, we're actually returning a GraphQL endpoint. So with this, we tell Next.js that there will be a GraphQL endpoint at the end of this. And also we're going to say it's an API and the body shouldn't be parsed. So this is one easy way to actually tell GraphQL and Next.js that where it's running, and that is running within Next.js. And this thing is actually running already now here. So we would have our GraphQL running inside Next.js. So Next.js runs on port 2000. We would have our API route, and then we have GraphQL. And then in here, we can get both the queries that we have here. So we have all products query, as you can see here. And then we have the all post query. and which you can see here. So you can also add IDs to them just for completion. And now I already stitched these two things together, but I stitched them together in part of the schema. I didn't really make any relationships between the code yet. But first, let's look at how our schema is stitched together. So I actually created a local schema as well, which we can ignore because, well, due to the length of this talk, I won't be able to tell you about how to make local schemas as well. So let's just have a look at how to stitch schemas together then. So we have a remote schema for our CMS, which is running on port 3001. And we would have a remote schema for our products API, which is basically our e-commerce API that's running on port 3002. And in here, I've just created a Apollo server. I'm going to give it some schema, which is stitched. So the stitch schema method, it comes from GraphQL Tools, and we're using it here to stitch all these schemas together. And also there's some boilerplate code in here to use the old playground, which you can also ignore. And then at the end of it, we're going to, as we're using Next.js API routes, we're going to be sending the creation method of the Apollo server there. So it's actually going to return the GraphQL endpoint at the end instead of React components. And literally, it's not that complicated to code I have here because we're just stitching schemas together like this. We have our GraphQL API for our CMS running here. Then we have our products API in GraphQL running at port 3002. And we're stitching them together with the local schema. So by using just this, we can just have both our GraphQL APIs in one single API. So that's schema stitching in short. But for the interesting part, so let me get my screen back to the code. And let me get back some of the code I earlier removed. So what we actually are going to do in order to really make the schemas together fitted as one, what we're actually going to do here when we create a remote schema for a CMS, we're going to transform some of the fields. So we're going to rename our field CMS underscore and then the actual field name. And the types will also be renamed because what we want to do, we don't want to automatically stitch the schemas together, which is something GraphQL Tools can also do for you, but we want to have some of more control. And this helps us whenever we maybe have overlapping field names or whatsoever. So the entire schema that we will get in from a CMS will now have CMS underscore as a prefix in order for us to have some separation. So if we would save this, our GraphQL server will be created again. And whenever we do this, we will have an issue, right? Because all posts no longer exist. It will now be CMS underscore all posts. And now it still works again. But now we have a separate name. So we no longer have a query to get all the posts. Instead, we have a query to get all the posts from the CMS, which is slightly different. And it's also a transformation we needed to make in order to make sure we don't have any overlapping or any conflicts whenever stitching or merging the fields together. So when stitching the fields together and there are some merge conflicts, they're sort of similar to how you have merge conflicts in GitHub. You try to resolve them, and sometimes it's easier just to transform things in order to get away with this, this sort of unwanted errors that you don't really want to have in there. So that's one part. So we are going to transform our CMS schema in order to have a CMS prefix. And the other thing we need to do is actually push the code together. So what we do in here, whenever we stitch the schemas together, we're going to change our type definitions a bit. So we're going to change the master schema, sort of. So we're going to extend our product type. And the product type is coming from our e-commerce API. And in there, we're going to add a new field called CMS metadata, which is also the product type from our CMS. So in our CMS, we're actually going to do this thing. So what are we going to do? We're going to create a product type in here as well, which has the same fields because we want to have this merge conflict that we saw before. So this would at some point give some errors if we didn't do the transformation. And in here, we're also going to look for products instead. Just to make it more transparent, because maybe you want to have your CMS to have posts as well, but also you want to have specific posts for products into a separate field. So let's assume that's the case. So when stitching the schemas together, we're going to extend the product type for the products coming from my e-commerce store to have the CMS underscore product type in there as well. And then in our product resolver, so we're actually going to create local resolvers that will stitch these types together. We will have the CMS metadata field, in which we're going to have some delegation to different schemas, which actually mean that we're going to stitch the field name CMS all products, which is actually this query. We're going to have a filter in there as well, because it takes a filter in which you're going to take a parent type from product, which is the product ID that you will see here, to have matching IDs. So in this scenario, your CMS would have matching IDs for products with your e-commerce API. And then based on this, it's going to stitch together. So if we would save this, this would still works. But something else we can actually do is we can paste this thing in here, sort of, unless we would have a CMS metadata field. Now, if we run this, you can see actually our products type from the CMS, it's merged into here. And now I've created a separate products type inside our CMS. It's something you don't have to do. We could still use the post in there if we wanted to. So if we go back to the code, we can also make this CMS all posts, still filter on product ID, change this a bit around and make this post. So that was also works. So that about schema stitching, and there's a bit more boilerplate code in here as well, but I think it's easiest if you just go to the GitHub repository and see for yourself what it looks like up there. So if we're going to resume with the slides, as I mentioned, you can find the code up here. So it's github.com/wordderek/headless schema stitching, and I also share a QR code later on. And I briefly mentioned the topic of Apollo Federation before as well. So you might wonder about Apollo Federations, because Apollo indeed discontinued the schema stitching, because at first it was something they were also advising to use. And I went for Apollo Federation, and I think Apollo Federation is a great tool. But it's also a tool that integrates very well with Apollo products. So if you're not that keen on using Apollo products, or maybe using separate open source or other libraries in your product, then it is something you might want to avoid. And also part of Federation might require some changes to your schema. So there's also something you can choose not to use. And I think schema stitching is a more general tool. It might require some more configuration and some more technical insights into the library. But in the end, I think it's a more powerful tool because it gives you more freedom. But still, Apollo Federation can be a nice way to go, determining on your product strategy. So what do you think? So I'm quite keen to see people in the chat, hear about thoughts you have about schema stitching, maybe also some other concerns you have about not using Apollo Federation, or maybe other GraphQL questions you have in general on this topic. And as I mentioned, you can find the code using this QR code. And you can also find me on Twitter, so make sure to keep the conversation alive there, or either in the chat. So my handle is @gethackteam. And in general, I hope you enjoyed. And I also hope you enjoy the rest of the conference so far. And you will enjoy the conference a bit more later on as well. So thank you all for your time. And hope to see you again somewhere soon. Thank you.